morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, September 16th, 2020. And if you're like me, you've probably heard a lot of people talking about how they want more law and order. They want to see laws enforced. But rarely, if ever, when you hear people say law and order, are they ever talking about what Thomas Paine referred to in America, law is king. Now, not necessarily in that reference, but we know that under the Constitution itself is the supreme law of the land. So most of the time when I hear people demanding this, they're really demanding that some law passed by some Congress, signed by some president at some point, at some time, that fits within their own political goal has to be enforced, while other stuff doesn't. And of course, they rarely, if ever, cite the Constitution. And today I want to talk about another one of these types of programs, which is pushing for law enforcement, but setting the stage for direct violations of the Constitution, primarily the Fourth Amendment and warrantless mass surveillance. That's Operation Legend. But before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. You can find all of the platforms we're on, all the individual shows. I've got tons of links and references for you to read and learn more on your own time. All the platforms, both video and audio. You can leave us reviews, for example, on iTunes and help us spread the word. All of that and more, including our membership program, where you can support us for as little as $2 a month, is over on the show homepage at 10thamendmentcenter.com/Path to Liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/Path to Liberty is the place where you need to go to follow everything related to this show and more, of course. And I just want to say a quick hello to everyone over in the live chat before we get into all the gory details of more federal violations of the Constitution, pushing local governments to act as tools of the federal police state, surveillance state. Hi over to Justin Morrison, to Neil, over to Funky Euphemism, Tyler B., Melissa Harrell, Anna Reyes, Michael White, Denver Libertarian, Dennis Barberger, greetings, buddy, MRGF78, Dan Reed says, who the hell wants more law? And that's really, we're living under, and you guys, I know you hear me say this till I am blue in the face, we live under the largest government in the history of the world. The last thing we need is more enforcement across the board. If they just enforce less of everything, we'd be in a way better place. Melissa Harrell, I think I already mentioned. Lawrence Smith, Political Brew over from Tyler, Texas, over on Periscope. Thanks to see you there. Good to see you there. And Shane down in Texas as well. Anyways, let's get right to this. And I first want to point out something that I covered this summer in an episode in July. What criminal laws are Congress authorized to make? Now, whether you want crime fighting to be done or not, the fact of the matter is the federal government is very limited in what is authorized to enforce as far as criminal law. Everything else is reserved to the states or to the people. And there are 5 main categories I covered in that episode. Basically all the normal criminal law, violence, property, attacks, theft, robbery, rape, all that stuff. These are done on a state-by-state basis, and you will find variance in the type of punishments that they have in each state across the country. But of course, a lot of people want the feds to come in and protect them. And a lot of times they also will tell you, well, we've got a lot of problems on the state level. How can we trust them? Of course, as a quick aside, all governments are terrible. All of them are there to violate your rights at every chance they can get. And we know that power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts, absolutely. But everything in between is dangerous as well. You should never trust anyone with power to endanger the public liberty. That's how John Adams put it. Or as Patrick Henry put it in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, he said, show me that time, that age and country where they trusted their rulers with power in the hopes that they were going to be good men. They were going to do the right thing with that power without a subsequent loss of liberty. That's a paraphrase, but I'm getting relatively close to the actual original because I say it so often. That was Patrick Henry. He was absolutely correct. So a lot of people tell me like, hey, Bolden, we got a problem with this local government. They're spying on us. They're doing gun control, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in a lot of those situations, in fact, most of them, I can't speak to every single one, of course, because there are tons of violations of liberty and rights in the Constitution, state and federal, across the board at every level of government. But in a lot of situations, when you dig into it, you follow the money, you can see that the federal government is actually the root cause of what actually only seems to be a local problem. From federal court cases, for example, that force unconstitutional federal power on all 50 states, or precedent that allows locals to do things that they shouldn't be able to do, or to federal grant programs that drive local policies and enforcement priorities. For example, I covered that as well in May, War on Liberty, an overview of federal programs that militarize and nationalize local police. All these previous episodes, really, they're great setup. If you haven't checked them out, I do encourage you to do so or to listen to them again. I will link to those in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And on that episode that I did in May, I went over the three main federal programs. There's really four. The three main federal grant programs that turn local police into part of the federal structure. That is the 1033, the militarization program that a lot of people have heard about. I'll talk about that again briefly in this show. Then there's the Department of Homeland Security grant program, the DHS grant program, and then from the Department of Justice, the Edward Byrne Justice Assistance Grant Program, the Byrne JAG program. And then the fourth is really federal task forces. And when local law enforcement participates in a federal task force, they are in essence acting as federal agents. And over the years, we have found many what are called memorandums of understanding or memorandums of agreement. You'll see these maybe in news reports once in a while as MOUs or MOAs. So, for example, in Glendale, Arizona, a few years ago, we uncovered, it just takes some Googling, they're public documents, it's that no one really covers it or looks into this. Glendale, Arizona police had a memorandum with the ATF to help the ATF enforce federal gun control. And you're going to find that kind of thing in most every jurisdiction around the country, whether it's with the ATF or the FBI or the Department of Justice or Homeland Security or the DEA or any of these other federal agencies that should barely exist, if at all, partnering with local law enforcement to do the federal government's bidding. Now, one example of a federal program that is really kind of enforced on this, push this kind of law and order narrative is something that I covered last year as well, Project Guardian. You remember that one? This was an effort by the federal government to enforce more federal gun control, even though at the time that it was announced by the Attorney General, the federal government had already enforced more federal gun control than at any time in history. So on August 5th of last year, on 2019, it was announced by the executive branch that they had not only banned bump stocks, but they had enforced more gun violations, as if under the Constitution, any gun act is considered illegal under the. There is no such thing. And if someone committed a violent act with a gun, that's not a gun. That's not a criminal act of owning a gun. That's a murder. It doesn't matter what tool you use, or it's robbery, whatever violence or theft that they use that was enabled by that. And then that's something that's dealt with at a state or local level, not the federal government. The last thing you want is the empire, the largest government in history, to actually be handling these important things because they're going to be politicized. Anyway, so Project Guardian was really all about enforcing more federal gun control, a surge of police forces around the country. And that's what the AG has been pushing for all along. And now he points out something that I point out all the time, that James Madison pointed out pretty often early on as well. That is, the federal government does not have the resources to enforce all of its so-called laws, regulations, and mandates. And this is actually, I just actually discovered this yesterday. I should have read through this in more detail last year. I don't know how I skipped this paragraph, but this is the memo from the Attorney General in, I guess it was December or November of 2019. He says this: "We remain cognizant that federal law enforcement represents only about 15% of all law enforcement resources nationwide. This is why, or that is why, our partnerships with and support of state, local, and tribal law enforcement and the communities they serve are critical to addressing gun crime. Now, I'm not sure how addressing gun crime is a federal purview. I mean, maybe the first thing that they should do is stop having all these laws on the books, like the National Firearms Act of 1934, the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988, or the Bump Stock Act ban of 2018, or the Gun Control Act of 1968, and there are others. 8 was, I guess, a bad number when it comes to gun control. So, as part of Project Guardian, the AG writes, the department will make available training and technical assistance to our state, local, and tribal partners to ensure they have the information they need to succeed. Further information on available training opportunities will be forthcoming. I covered this in more detail, basically talking about this federal project, this federal surge for more federal gun control. And now we have another example that has come out in the summer of this year. It started really in July. Operation Legend. It was named after someone, I'm not sure if his name was Legend or whatever, but it was basically the first name of someone who was murdered. So they named it after that. That sounds like kind of a political opportunist move, but that's what they do. It was launched by the Department of Justice in July. And now, depending where you lie on the political spectrum, you're either going to be hearing that it's just the most amazing success or the most evil monstrosity coming from the central government in history. There's very little honest reporting. I think I found some that's actually very interesting, and I did some research myself to verify a lot of what we're going to be covering here today. So this is an article over at the Intercept from a lady named Katya Schwenk. And she puts it this way: Operation Legend and its December precursor, Operation Relentless Pursuit, are both funding surveillance technology in cities across the country. So, surprise, surprise, they're going in to supposedly restore law and order, but they're ramping up surveillance tools. They're ramping up warrantless mass surveillance. And if you understand how the whole network works, just the brief overview, when local law enforcement conducts surveillance, they are often acting as a tool of the federal government. So they collect their surveillance locally. Generally, they use the tools that are provided to them through federal grant programs, like the DHS or the JAG program for the Department of Justice, or they use military-style equipment from 1033. And they collect that information, they pass the information through fusion centers, or the post-Patriot Act time, the information sharing environment, ISE, and anything collected in one city, Memphis, for example, is shared with everybody, the federal government, all other locals. So this is really just, they're acting as local extensions of the federal surveillance state, and they're really doing it a lot through federal grants and federal programs, federal directives. For example, Operation Legend, which has the nice political cover of protecting people from violence or protecting property. And that's how it's presented to people. We're going to go in and get criminals, et cetera, et cetera. But in the wake of that, they're leaving behind an expanded surveillance network that a federal administration in the future, current and future, they're going to have access to more tools. And it also has a gun control purview, an underlying subtext of gun control as well that I'm going to get to here in a few. So she goes further. Katya says, Memphis and 4 other cities received grants for gunshot detection technology. Of course, let's say you think this is a great thing. I would say the last people you want implementing gunshot detection technology is Washington, D.C. Let's say you love the people who are in there today. You shouldn't. It's the largest government in history, and it doesn't matter who's in there. If they're directing it and not putting their neck on the line at every second to cut back rather than continue expanding, they are not the good guys. So the last people, let's say you think they're all awesome. Someone in the future is going to use expanded gunshot detection technology in various cities in really, really bad ways. I don't think it takes a lot of imagination to figure out what they might do. They say other more opaque grants from the Justice Department, like a $1.4 million grant to Shelby County, which is surrounding Memphis, in April, and a $1 million grant in July to the city of Cleveland, are to be used in part for, quote, technological solutions or support for investigations. Going further, she writes, awash in these federal funds, cities have doubled down on their surveillance investments even as they face general budget shortfalls in the tens of millions. I really need to connect the dots on this a little bit more, but I'm seeing almost every time I dig into something, you hear about a local government doing something they shouldn't be doing. Well, why are they expanding this surveillance tool? Well, you didn't probably hear in the news or even on social media or wherever, you didn't hear that they got a $1.4 million grant and then they went and bought some overpriced, maybe ineffective, maybe really effective tool and just kept expanding their departments. And that's what happens with the war on drugs, the war on terror, the war on everything. And of course, everything that the government wages war on, we seem to get more of, because even if they're doing something that they're supposed to be doing, they just are awful at it. We can't trust these people to do the right thing. So looking a little bit further at some of these grants. So on August 4th, 2 days before Operation Legend was formally announced in that city. Now, it was announced originally, I think, in Kansas City in July. Then it was announced in Memphis. And mind you, it's interesting that Memphis is kind of a target. Maybe there's a lot of crime going on there and they can use it as a testing ground for more surveillance and more gun control detection, whatever it may be. We know that there are a lot of government organizations testing thermal detection of concealed carry, because they don't like the idea of people being able to exercise their right to keep and bear arms, even if they have a permission slip from the government, which is just absurd in the first place. But this Project Guardian thing was also, the Attorney General did his announcement in Memphis. So maybe somebody else knows the connection to Memphis better than I do, but I just kind of noticed that and thought it was unusual. So on August 4th, 2 days before Operation Legend was formally announced in the city, Memphis signed a new contract with Cellebrite. And I know I've had a few people ask me to at least talk about Cellebrite. And this is going to just be a brief insight into that. It's popular. It's an Israeli forensics manufacturer, popular with law enforcement, whose products can hack and extract data from smartphones. So August 4th, Memphis did that. August 12th, the city of Detroit, another of the 9 cities targeted by Operation Legend, also placed a $100,000 order with Cellebrite to acquire the company's premium software package, and 2 weeks later renewed an older license with the company for another $22,000, more than tripling 2018 and 2019 expenditures. So you shouldn't be surprised. I think Katya is connecting the dots here. She's seeing, okay, these cities have been picked out. These are just 2 of the many. Chicago, we can cover a little bit here as well. But they go into these cities. They say, we're going to go protect people. And then kind of behind the scenes, they're handing out a bunch of cash, which is primarily stolen from you and I. Most of the tax money that they have, most of the money, if not all of it, they shouldn't have in the first place. So these types of grant programs shouldn't exist as well. So let's say they're just fighting crime and they're just fighting the idea, they're just violating the idea that the federal government, or the restrictions in the Constitution the federal government has on enforcing criminal law. On top of it, they're adding these grant programs and they're throwing cash around, and then the local government gets these expansive surveillance tools, and then the local government permanently has the ability to share all that data with the federal government. This is a long game and it's not good. Let's look at Chicago. On Chicago, they announced on August 14th that it would employ enhanced technology for, quote, around-the-clock monitoring of social media to identify looters. Of course, they're only going to use this to get the bad guys. The Patriot Act, we were told, was just going to be used to get the terrorists coming to destroy our homes and our lives and coming to get our freedom. Instead, what it really was the government itself supposedly protecting us from terror, protecting us from violations of our freedom, violating our freedom and our liberty and our inherent natural rights in order to do so. So this is absolutely absurd that they would do that. We also know that the income tax was originally going to be a temporary wartime measure. The individual income tax, a temporary wartime measure of just a couple of points. Maybe it was like 2%. I forget the number. Very small on only the richest of the rich. And we know that is expanded across the board today. It is a massive amount. And as soon as you give these people an inch, they're going to take a mile. So Chicago is now doing around-the-clock monitoring of social media to identify looters. Do you think it's only going to stay at going after looters? Do not trust government, and do not trust the people who are pushing this either. Now, we heard, of course, that the mayor, remember back in July, I'm sure you probably heard this, the mayor was taking a big stand against the federal administration, saying, you're not going to come line in the sand here. We're going to make a very strict line in the sand, and we're going to make sure that you guys don't cross that line. And I think that was political posturing too. And in fact, most of the local opposition to things that we've seen recently is just political garbage. They're not really, they should be doing that, but they're not really honest about it. Because just a couple weeks later, that same mayor in Chicago in August announced a new task force on looting in partnership with the FBI. Quote, this task force, she said, is already reviewing video camera footage and other evidence to identify perpetrators and developing small cases against them. Of course, that you want to prosecute looters. You want to prosecute criminals. But to be honest with you, the worst criminals that we face today are in government, both at the federal, state, and local level. And I just don't trust these guys working together. I don't trust their unconstitutional surveillance. I don't trust... as old Abraham White, in my episode on anti-federalist warnings a couple of weeks ago, old Abraham White in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, he said, I wouldn't trust 1,000 Moseses. And I'm on board with that message. I think that's one that I need to use more often. So we talk about the Department of Defense, the 1033 program, and these other grant programs pretty regularly. I covered that in that episode earlier this year. And here Katya talks about it a little more. She says the Department of Defense's 1033 program is perhaps the best known example of federal investment. It's an odd term. It's a little too soft in my books. It's not really investment. It's unconstitutional ripoffs and unconstitutional granting, but whatever. It's investment in policing. But the Homeland Security and Justice Departments also fund law enforcement to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars per year. She goes back to Memphis. They are a prime example. So Memphis has something going on, some kind of tie with Washington, D.C., because over a full decade, the city has had a license plate reader system. You've heard me, if you listen to the show regularly, talk about ALPRs, automated license plate readers. I did an episode, I think it was in 2018, called Surveillance State Goes Wild, $2.5 billion. I was talking about information released by EFF and Muckrock through Freedom of Information Act requests to 200 law enforcement agencies around the country. They actually requested many more, but of 200, over a 2.5 to 3 year period, they found that there were 2.5 billion license plate scans that were done, that were tracking and tracing where people were going around the country for the crime of literally getting in your car and traveling. So they were scanning that, they were uploading all the information through fusion centers and ISC, and then to the DEA and sharing it with everybody. So you have this entire network of tracking the location of people. We know that some of those cameras can snap up to like 600 to 800 pictures per second with extreme accuracy. We also know that some of them have facial recognition to recognize passengers in cars as well. We should expect that to expand. Well, Memphis has been doing this. They're certainly using federal funds through the Edward Byrne Justice Assistant Grant Program. They have this license plate reader system. It's, quote, real-time crime center, Katia writes, which houses a video wall of live surveillance camera feeds. I've seen some pictures of this. I can't share them. They tend to be all copyrighted, and I just don't want to get in trouble with the live streaming platforms. They probably don't like us as it is. So, and it also has a gunshot recognition camera system. So gunshot recognition and license plate reader all fed into this giant command center with a wall of windows where there's people monitoring it 24 hours a day. It's funded at least in part through the Department of Justice. Where does that money come from? They're stealing it from people. Why should people across the country all be pitching in for a giant surveillance system in Memphis and other cities? Katia goes on. She says, years of federal investment, federal involvement, federal funding of local surveillance is a better way to put it, have resulted in what Faiza Patel, co-director of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program, calls a layering effect. He says these things don't come all at once, and that's kind of what I'm getting into with this new Operation Legend. They don't all come at once. You get a little bit of funding for this, and then they establish a new spying system, and then a few years later, they've got this, and like, well, this kind of shot spotter thing, it needs to be fine-tuned. We need to add more cameras so we can associate that with the sounds. And it's going to build and build and build. And eventually they'll say, well, then we need facial recognition. We need gait recognition. We need audio recognition of people's voices. Over time, none of us should be surprised when this thing expands and expands and expands. And Patel is absolutely right. He says these things don't come all at once. They build up. And when you start feeding one surveillance technology after another into a database, you give police departments, and in essence, every time you give a local police department the ability to do something, you're giving the same thing to the DEA, the ATF, the FBI, the DHS, and all these other federal agencies. You're giving them the ability to track what people are doing very closely. And we know for a fact that, for example, the license plate reader program, the only reason we know about these things is because someone leaked the documents a few years ago to Reuters that the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, which shouldn't exist, or is it administration, whatever the hell the name of that thing is, they shouldn't exist. People who work there should get real jobs. It should not exist at all. If there's going to be enforcement, it's going to be on a state or a local level, not federal. But the DEA had been running a nationwide license plate tracking program, keeping tabs on where people were going for 8 years, using local law enforcement license plate reader programs. That's basically how all this stuff works. So these types of grant programs are just throwing cash around. So this layering effect is a real problem. And she goes on, she says, technologies popular with federal agencies tend to make their way down to the local level. I've often said that things that they do overseas in the war on terror, whatever you want to call it, end up coming home. You start seeing more and more drones, and they're probably, who knows what the, I'm not even going to run down that rabbit hole. They say, take, for example, the new popularity of phone hacking technology with police. It was first picked up more than a decade ago by federal agencies like ICE and the FBI. Now more and more cities are using that same thing. So they use it in small levels, and then they get some lobbying, or they decide to push for some cash, and then they want to, because they recognize that federal law enforcement only accounts for, as the AG said last year, about 15% of all law enforcement. They know that if they want to do something, they have to throw money and incentives at the local law enforcement to get them to participate. The Bureau of Justice Assistance, that's the JAG program, which has offered generous grants to Memphis, Detroit, and other cities through Operation Legend this summer, has previously funded Celebrite products for police departments in Florida, Maryland, Kansas, and Idaho. It has also, Katia writes, funded artificial intelligence-based data repositories, predictive analytics, and social media monitoring tools. And this, as we're getting close to the end here, I want to talk about ShotSpotter. This is really, to me, it's an audio detection of gunshots. And the idea behind it is, well, we want to have police respond to illegal use of firearms. They want to be able to solve crimes. So, of course, the only way that they can ever think of making the world safer, rather than limiting the amount of gun control there is, and only leaving guns in the hands of the more criminal elements of society, the only thing you can think of is throwing more surveillance. You're going to have to watch and listen to everything. And ShotSpotter is a great example of that. They are the largest gunshot detection provider in the country, and they are a major beneficiary of Operation Legend. There's always seems, from this Attorney General, there always seems to be a subtext of gun law enforcement. And that is not something that that's not a Second Amendment administration at all. The company spent $2 million lobbying legislators over the last decade, and they provided, the Operation Legend provided a windfall. 5 cities, Memphis, Cleveland, Albuquerque, Milwaukee, where I grew up, and Detroit, will receive grants to purchase or expand their gunshot detection through the program. Milwaukee already has a ShotSpotter system in place, and Detroit now plans to deploy it again after they first piloted the technology in 2014. For those of you who are watching this, others probably are far more aware of ShotSpotter than I am. I've seen articles over at GOA, Truth About Guns, even the Brady Center. No one really ever thinks that this is a really effective tool. So that tells me that even though some places, I think San Antonio started it and then they dropped it because they found that it actually didn't help them do anything. They didn't solve any additional criminal acts. So that tells me that they know what's going on, but they're setting the stage for more monitoring, more surveillance of full cities and full neighborhoods. And here's an interesting thing from Matthew Guariglia. I apologize for getting that name, Matthew. I'm sure I got it wrong. He says, if you live in a neighborhood that has a gun violence problem, not only are you subjected to that, think about that. If, let's say, you're living in a high crime area, so that has to be part of your life. He skips pointing out that in most of those areas, there are very strict gun control measures. So the only way to actually defend yourself is to rely on law enforcement, rely on government to show up an hour after something happens, or break the law, run the risk of getting arrested for having something that you're not allowed to have to defend yourself and your family. He says, not only are you subjected to that, you're also subjected to the surveillance regime that comes along with it. So if you can only afford to live in a poor neighborhood, you're definitely going to be spied on. And a lot of people talk about how government is racist. I think government is just evil, and they're going to actually use their power against the least fortunate in society. That's where they can get away with it the most. I don't think if they were going to set up shop in Bel Air, well, maybe, who knows? Who knows? I would think that maybe there'd be a little bit more opposition to people monitoring video and sound. I mean, you got a lot of Hollywood affairs going on. Maybe they don't want to know. They've already got to deal with TMZ. They probably don't want government street surveillance too. Anyway, so if you're living in one of those neighborhoods, I think Matthew is absolutely correct over at EFF, saying specifically, like, you already have to deal with that. Now you're going to be dealt another blow, and that is the surveillance regime. And he says much of this equipment and technology is given under the guise of either narcotics, so drug war, policing, or counterterrorism. They're always protecting us from somebody. And as James Madison warned us in May of 1798, he wrote in a letter to Thomas Jefferson in the ramp up to the passage of the hated and evil Alien and Sedition Acts, he says, perhaps it's a universal truth that the loss of liberty, I'm paraphrasing, the loss of liberty at home is to be charged against dangers, real or pretended, from abroad. So basically, whether there's a real danger or a pretended one, they're always going to use the fear of that to expand government and take your liberty. Matthew goes on, he says, ultimately, a lot of this surveillance equipment gets used to monitor protests. It's not good news. It's not good news. Now, you can find a lot of, like I said, a lot of posts talking about how ShotSpotter doesn't work. It's not effective. To me, it's less about whether or not it's effective, but it's really the subtext of more federal gun control enforcement, more local gun control enforcement. And if we believe in the natural right to keep and bear arms, none of these laws are supported by the Constitution, either on a state or a federal level. So in the end, what we're talking about is unconstitutional federal grant programs for unconstitutional federal crime fighting programs and unconstitutional warrantless surveillance, all with the goal of stopping guns. And if you look at some of the reports, I don't have them up for the show here today. Maybe I'll cover that when there's more detail and more data available in the future. But so far, every time I see a press release on Operation Legend, they're talking about, well, 50% of the people were arrested for illegal guns or illegal purchases. And under the Constitution, there is no such thing as an illegal gun. There is no such thing as an illegal transfer. There is no such thing as a paperwork error. And as long as people continue to comply with those things, there's no reason for them to get rid of those violations of your natural right to defend yourself. Now, if there's really any layering effect happening, I think it is this Band-Aid over a Band-Aid over a Band-Aid instead of following the Constitution, and that is the real problem. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. At very best, I'm just scratching the surface, and I'm kind of learning about this as I go. This is a new program, and I'm just digging through and looking and seeing where the cash is being handed out, and it's really the same thing that I see on almost every local problem, every federal problem. It's a partnership between state and local law enforcement to expand monitoring of all your activities, and we know that powerful people in government will use that to crush dissent, to crush protest, maybe to stop you from even being able to go to work. What a surprise. Scott Lashwell points out that every bit of this technology is 100% hackable. It would be true irony if the technology is used against tyranny. Interesting. Interesting. The state of Maine was not only tracking who was coming and going into the state, but they were also building a gun registry. Well, that's probably, I hadn't even thought of that, but like I said, it doesn't take a lot It doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure out how they're going to use this stuff. Funky Euphemism says one of the only not terrible things insisting we all wear masks is insisting their facial recognition is useless. Absolutely. Because in 17 states, they actually make that illegal to some degree to cover your face to evade cops, to evade government. Neil is awesome over on YouTube, says the TAC is one of the few liberty organizations that don't waste donor money. We do not. There's not enough to go around, let me tell you. And I really appreciate your support, along with the Mises Institute, who I love and support and have. They've been so kind to me. I was a speaker at their annual supporters summit last year here in Los Angeles, and that was absolutely cool. Thanks to Jeff Dice, Tom Woods, and so many others who have been so kind to me for the longest time. W.C. Holmes says, when is TAC leaving California? Seems to be a smart move. Why would I leave my home? No way, man. I love my tyranny warm, and there is no place in the country that I've found that isn't a mass surveillance prohibition hub. It's just different versions of it. In this state, they prohibit one item. In another state, they prohibit another item. Maybe, I don't know, we'll see. I do like being warm and comfortable and being able to walk everywhere. So New York is definitely out for me. So for my life and my family and friends, it's definitely going to be here. But I appreciate you mentioning that, WC. Then making a move would be insane. I just moved 7 blocks this summer. And luckily I got pandemic pricing because I was able to upgrade my apartment but pay less per month than I was before. Anyways, I'm just rambling into personal stuff at this point now, and I really, really appreciate all the comments. I'll read through the rest of it a little bit later today. I reply to as many as I can. Of course, you can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I get tons of show ideas from questions, ideas, and suggestions, not only through the comments, but also through email. So thank you very much for that. And of course, if you support the show, you like what we're doing, smash the like button, subscribe. Reviews on iTunes and other podcast platforms help more than you can even imagine. All the algorithms that you may watch or listen on are very easily triggered. And so when you do that stuff, it tells the platform to show the program to more people. And you can also support us financially. There's a bunch of members out here that I see joining us during the live chat. And I'm so very grateful for those of you who are putting your financial faith behind our work. There is no way we could get the job done without it. Please, if you're not already a member, don't feel pressured to join us, but if you can afford a couple of bucks a month, we start our membership program as little as $2 per month, and you can sign up for that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. On Friday, I'm doing an episode that's going to cover some of the warnings from George Washington's famous farewell address, originally drafted by James Madison, but that he gave in 1796. The anniversary of that is on Sunday. Of course, tomorrow is Constitution Day, so if you're not on our email newsletter, you're going to miss out on something fun that we're going to send out. I'm not 100% sure what we'll send out tomorrow morning, but that will be coming soon as well. And again, thank you for joining me here today. I hope you're having a good Wednesday, and I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.